So, the question that probably a lot of people might want to ask is why women and girls? For those, especially for those outside of the DRR kind of sphere, you might wonder why the focus on women and girls. Well, as you can see from the first sentence, overall survival rates for women and girls justify this response. An Oxfam report after the aftermath of the Asian tsunami in 2004 highlighted that in some villages 80% of those killed were actually female. And you are 14 times more likely to survive a disaster event if you're male. So that straight away, I think, answers the question as to why we need to focus on this group, this particular at-risk group. Ingrained within that kind of that broader headline, is some ingrained socio-economic issues. So the continuance of, or the kind of, the ingrained issues regarding the jobs that women and girls traditionally have, particularly in developing societies, mean that they are put at risk. So for instance, one of the reasons that the tsunami impacted women so heavily was because men traditionally within coastal communities would be out at sea fishing, and this was the case when the wave kind of started to inundate the land. And also, from a cultural perspective, women and girls aren't normally taught how to swim or don't learn how to swim because there isn't actually that need for it. And again, this was highlighted in the Oxfam report that was released 10 years after the event. And this further goes on to look at kind of reduced agency in developing policies. If you have a group of people who are marginalised in such a way, it's very difficult for them to be involved with the discussion to developing future policies with regards to DRR, and that makes it very difficult for any change or any improvement to happen. So it's really a kind of a never-ending cycle. So that's kind of to sum up why I thought women and girls should be focused on. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. As you all know, there's several organisations out there who focus specifically on the issue of women and girls in disasters, GDN being one. And this quote I thought was quite telling. It highlights from the UNISDR's report, the report into the kind of the mid-term review of HFA1 for Asia and the Pacific. You can see here that although countries have kind of good reason to include these specifically vulnerable groups, many of them, when it comes down to a national level, aren't including that into their policy making. So therefore, it's really difficult to see that even though the HFA1 was an overarching multinational agreement, albeit with voluntary agreements, it's difficult to see how at a national level these kind of overarching policies are actually having any kind of real impact at a grassroots level or even a national level. So I thought this was an interesting quote for us to have a quick look at. And then the question kind of comes up, why women and girls? Does this mean we are excluding men and boys? No, we're not, and I'm not suggesting we should. I've chosen women and girls for this specific presentation because of the data I shared with you earlier, and the complete imbalance between deaths, injuries and economic losses following various disaster events. But we shouldn't overlook the need of men and boys and the specific risks that they will face, particularly again within developing nations. And that's something that we really need to not forget. So moving on to some examples, as I said before, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami is a really good example of, I use that lightly, is a kind of a useful example as to how disasters are gendered. I've gone over the figures there, and I've discussed there mainly about the kind of the male employment in coastal towns being one of the reasons as to why those gender imbalances existed in that particular situation. But it's not just in developing nations. This also is an issue in developed nations. And One particular example of that is the 2005 Hurricane Katrina that struck New Orleans. US, obviously, the #1 country in terms of GDP, many other indicators. However, the people who were impacted by this event, 26% of those women, 26% of those women who were impacted fell below the poverty line in comparison with only 20% of men. A knock-on effect of that, because of that poverty level, is that fewer women actually had cars, so therefore they were unable to escape or to move to safer ground when the warnings were given out. Those who did have cars really kind of had to weigh up the difficulty in whether to go and what kind of passengers they were going to be taking. Women traditionally, particularly in this example, were found to be in charge of looking after children and elderly relatives. So therefore, obviously, cars are only ever so big. So you have a real kind of dilemma if you're a woman in charge of that escape mode as to who you take. It might involve multiple trips, you know, so that really added on some extra pressure onto women and girls within this particular disaster. And then following on from that, we had quite a large increase of violent and sexual assaults on women and girls in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And it was actually shown that, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. So it was actually shown that before Hurricane Katrina, we had 4.6 out of every 100,000 women were subject to violent or sexual abuse. And in the year after, it actually risen to 16.3 out of every 100,000. So it's a dramatic increase in that kind of violence. And that's something, again, that we see in multiple disasters throughout the globe, regardless of developed or developing status. So again, a really kind of key point to highlight. So the DRR Framework for Action, as in implementation in 2005, and it's lasted up until this year, gender was at the forefront. Gender was kind of one of the areas that had really been noted and had been identified as an area that really needed to be carried through. However, this, as I said before, really didn't feed down onto a local level, and we had some real shortages in terms of providing that institutional capacity, giving that knowledge out, in ensuring that practitioner level people who are involved in DRR were able to respond to these gendered issues in a way that really kind of contributed to balancing out the discrepancies in death rates or in injuries. We also had methods of support on women-led approaches, grassroots organisation, sometimes led by women, sometimes kind of focused on women. They really had difficulty in making sure that, one, they could understand what was included in the HFA, how they were to implement the policies that were included in HFA, and really how to use that as a guideline, as a tool to be able to implement what they wanted and to improve things for women and girls in those 10 years. And then we had a promotion of risk-reducing social and economic policies. Now, as I said before, it's this circle whereby these social policies and these economic policies really perpetuate that risk that people face, particularly women and girls, and as I'm sure the other panels are going to go, other panel members are going to go into in a moment. You know, this is something that it was found in HFA1, that this kind of perpetual cycle of at-risk communities was really identified as failing in HFA1, and I don't think there are many people who would argue with that point, with that kind of that lack of guidance. So how can we improve on that? You know, we're currently approaching Sendai. I'm personally flying out to Sendai on Monday, so I will be there, and I'm hoping to be able to really kind of push the issue of gender and onto basically anyone I meet. So looking at the zero draft, which I appreciate isn't the most recent draft, I've done that because a couple of the panel members have also used the zero draft as kind of a basis text. You'll see that the search term women is actually only kind of comes up twice or in two sections. Preamble very kind of fluffy language. And then we have a very specific section here, but actually that's not much of an improvement on HFA 1. So it's really, are we learning the lessons from what's happened in the past from HFA 1, and how are we able to improve on that? And again, the same for gender. If you look at the search term for gender in the zero draft, we have just 3 instances. Again, very kind of, the first one very very fluffy, not too specific. And then we also have some kind of broader at-risk community language here. A couple of these areas are going to be discussed today. So it's very kind of the terminology that's being used. And again, this is a zero draft. So it may well change before the final text. But still, the way they've started isn't a great start. So working with the Gender Disasters Network, or GDN, we've come up with a set of suggestions as to how they might improve this in terms of women and girls. As you can see here, I've kind of summed them up. I mean, the concept note has actually been sent off now, and it will be available for download, I think, from GDN's website relatively shortly. So really, the first thing, and maybe probably the overarching thing, is to ensure that the language, the general language that's used in these frameworks, don't make at-risk communities invisible. And I think that's a failure of HFA 1. I think it was really very key that the language used was very broad, inclusive, which I appreciate why it had to be. However, I think we really need to make sure now that language in Post-2015 framework is much more specific as to the type of indicators and targets that we're after. Better and more efficient baseline data. Anyone who is interested in gender and DRR will recognise the term disaggregated data is kind of a key word. Everyone talks about kind of disaggregated data as a key tool to make sure that we're understanding how gender and age and disability and ethnicity are included in that. And then we also need to make sure that DRR investment must be informalised. At the moment it's very high level. We have very high level streams of funding where funding exists. We need to make sure that that's coming down to the local level, to make sure that these grassroots organisations who are ensuring that women and girls are given a voice in DRR are heard and are funded and are actually able to contribute in an effective way. And then lastly, we really need to make sure that the gender disaster preparedness for effective responses. So in terms of using an example of Build Back Better, we need to make sure that women are included in that decision-making process. We need to make sure that the funds are allotted in a fair and open and transparent way. And we also need to make sure that kind of that rehabilitation, that reconstruction is benefiting all in the community as opposed to just a few. So that's the end of my presentation. Presentations will be available if you would like them. I can email them to you, so please drop me an email if you need them. But now I'm going to pass over to Emma Lovell from the ODI, and Emma is going to discuss. Right, sorry. So Emma is going to discuss ethnicities and, oh dear, what am I doing? I can't find it, sorry. Yeah, no, it should be here. I think it's fallen off somewhere. Sorry, apologies about this.
Do you have the... The which one?
No, I've got it. Yeah, sorry. Here we are. Thank you very much. Okay. Apologies for that. Maybe
Thank you for coming. My name is Emma Lovell. I'm a research officer at the Overseas Development Institute, and I'm going to be looking at Indigenous populations and ethnic groups in disaster risk reduction. I'm going to start by looking at the ways in which Indigenous populations and ethnic groups are discriminated and excluded in decision making and implementation. I'll look at the benefits and challenges of including Indigenous populations and ethnic groups in these processes, and then the integration of science and technology and Indigenous knowledge. I'm going to move on to the policy level and look at what the Zero Draft currently says in relation to these groups and how it can be strengthened. Indigenous populations and ethnic groups can be discriminated and excluded on the basis of their ethnicity and cultural factors, including languages, cultural norms, religious practices, that impact on their vulnerability and capacity to deal with a disaster. They may experience limited rights, social protection, and social norms, as well as access to basic services such as education, healthcare, and early warning assistance. They may be excluded from participating in decision making that affects their lives, and are often neglected in data collection, whether it's official census data or disaster data, making it very hard to tell how many Indigenous population, people and ethnic groups have been affected by a disaster. Globally, people's perceptions of risk are dependent on their cultural values and norms. And during the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines, the Aitas who live on the flanks of the volcano believed that their god, who lived inside the volcano, would not let them come to any harm. As a result, many of them chose not to evacuate. Of those who did, many turned back because they couldn't read the signs on the buses telling them where to go. This showed that the state did not acknowledge the different people and languages of the people living around the volcano most at risk of disasters. There are a number of benefits of including Indigenous knowledge and practices within DRR planning and policies. Indigenous populations and ethnic groups, Indigenous populations and ethnic groups have used many different traditional knowledge, practices and skills to enable them to prepare for, cope with and respond to disasters. They've used their experience of behaviour of the land, water and animals to act as an early warning system to help them predict and anticipate the time, frequency and duration of different events. Knowledge has been passed down and evolves over many different generations in history, and is dependent on local needs and different political, economic, social and cultural processes that exist within the society. Specific principles, knowledge and skills can be transferred and adapted to other societies, that as long as they are based on similar contexts and experiencing similar conditions. And at the same time, there's recognition of the important contribution that Indigenous knowledge can have to environmental management, biodiversity and sustainability, based on their experience of the local environment. However, there are a number of challenges for mainstreaming disaster risk, the knowledge and practices into DRR planning. Due to different social, economic, cultural and political changes and Western influences, traditional knowledge and practices are under threat and some have been lost. DRR planning tends to ignore these different processes that exist within society, and Indigenous people are excluded from participating in decision making. DRR strategies have tended to be top-down, and knowledge not embedded in science and technology has tended to be disregarded. At the same time, communities and different organisations have very differing perceptions of risk and what they deem to be important. And this can have a big impact on what the values and kind of logic are for dealing with these different types of risk. There are also challenges in terms of scaling up Indigenous knowledge and practices because they are localised and they need to be transferred or adapted to similar contexts, whereas science and technology is deemed to be universally applicable by some. Many lives, however, could be saved and livelihoods preserved when DRR interventions acknowledge the different Indigenous traditions and practices that exist. In the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, the people of this Indonesian island used oral traditions to help advise them of what to predict when a tsunami was going to happen. This was the changes in sea level as water, as well as the buffalo running to the hills. And as a result, they also were able to retreat to the hills in time, and only 7 out of 78,000 people were killed. Indigenous people have practices, knowledge and traditions that can help enhance DRR planning and build resilience, as well as enhance innovation within disaster risk reduction planning. Policymakers have an opportunity to integrate Indigenous knowledge, traditions and skills into their planning, but it's essential that it's collaborative, cooperative and partnership based, and uses participatory approaches as well as horizontal planning to integrate within the decision making. Sorry. It's essential that DRR planning is inclusive and that Indigenous people are empowered to use their knowledge in order to inform these strategies and plans, which will hopefully make them more sustainable in the long term. It is also important that this is complementary to science and technology. So now looking at the policy angle, the zero draft for the Post-2015 Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which I think you all have in your hands or on your seats, currently includes Indigenous populations and ethnic groups in the following ways. It acknowledges the engagement and participation of Indigenous people and the value of traditional and Indigenous knowledge within planning, early warning systems, and to inform different strategies. It also acknowledges the importance of local action and leadership in disaster risk reduction and management through local authorities and Indigenous people, and acknowledges the importance of the protection of sites of historical, cultural and religious interest. Sorry, big point to mention is ethnic groups are not mentioned once within the draft as that. So during a recent ODI event, a wide group of stakeholders came together to come up with a joint statement and set of recommendations in terms of what needed to be retained in the zero draft and what could be strengthened or improved. Those that are most relevant to Indigenous populations and ethnic groups are shown here, although obviously this isn't exhaustive, we've got limited space and time. So this included the need to insert ethnic groups within the list of stakeholders that Kevin already mentioned women were a part of. It also needs to include political when mentioning economic, social, cultural and social practices and policies and measures. And again, one of the items that Kevin mentioned, the importance of gender, age, disability, ethnicity and culturally sensitive disaggregated data and perspectives within the framework. And also when measuring, obviously, progress towards that. It's essential that these plans are prepared for in different languages and are made accessible to everyone and disseminated wisely using traditional means of communication in a way that is accessible and addresses all different needs and perspectives. The lack of attention to Indigenous people, ethnic groups and their traditional capacities, practice, knowledge and skills undermines the effectiveness and sustainability of disaster risk reduction. DRR policies and plans need to take into account the different needs, vulnerabilities, capacities and expectations of all in order to build resilience effectively and equitably. The zero draft must advocate for different DRR practices that promote human rights, foster community participation and value local and traditional knowledge, skills and capacities, as well as equitable access to resources. Thank you very much.
Right, good evening. So, the clues in the name, Age International. Age International is one of the only, unique UK charity that's actually focusing on older people in lower middle income countries. But we do this as part of a wider network, a global network of organizations called Help Age International, which some of you may have come across. And for those who are very keen on the visuals, you might have noticed the branding, the visual branding of Age International is very close to something that you see a lot on the streets of Age UK, and that's because we're also part of the Age UK group. So effectively, Age UK has two charities, one which is focused on the UK and the other one which is focused internationally. As part of the work that we do as Age International, we are also members of the Disasters Emergency Committee. So you will also see our name about when it comes to humanitarian appeals. So why are we doing this? And there's an elephant in the room. I mean, you know, the obvious thing is that here in the UK, we take it for granted that we all know about older people. Aging is all around us. You can't walk down the street without seeing some headline that's about older people. But as soon as we shift our focus and our gaze to developing countries, to lower middle income countries, it's like a filter is put over us, and we absolutely can't see anymore the things that are most obvious in front of us. And older people are practically invisible in international development discourse. So I want to kind of run you through a quick primer in terms of what's going on. So first of all, today we have about 868 million people over the age of 60. In terms of the discussion we're having now, 26 million people are being affected by natural disasters every year. That's just natural disasters. We're not talking about other types of conflict, and we're not talking about other types of emergency situations and difficulties. The numbers are pretty shocking at the moment, how people are affected. But when we look ahead into the future, what we see is that, okay, 8 million today, but by 2030, when the new Sustainable Development Goals are going to come to an end, that figure is going to be 1.3 billion, 16%, and then finally, 2050, we're looking at 21% of the world's population. And some of you are still thinking, yeah, so what? So we know that a lot of older people are there. What you don't see in these slides, however, is that 80% by 2050 of all of those older people are going to be living in what are now developing countries. And currently today, over 2/3 of older people are living in developing countries. So this is a development reality, basically. Yet again, we're just not seeing it. So if you needed any more convincing, have a look at this slide. And what this illustrates, really graphically, is just how radically the demographics have changed over the years. So what you have in the middle is in 1950, nice traditional structure, lots of younger people, not many people living to be older. Already by 2020, you've got a huge change. We've got a youth bulge going on, lots more younger people, but also a lot of people living longer. 2050, all of a sudden we have a column. So we're not anymore talking about this pyramid where you've got just youth, lots of children. We're actually talking about people living longer and living, and more people living longer. And then finally, the blue, the dotted, and by the way, I really dislike projections, because what you never get a chance to see is, people showing you how they got things wrong. But we'll just assume that this is correct. And the really striking feature here is what happens at the bottom. Because we don't really know if that's going to happen, but that's a prediction, but it's a very possible reality. We can't take for granted the demographic structure of society. Now, some people are looking at this and thinking, this is a horrible thing, this is going to be, the destruction of society, how are we going to possibly cope? There are no value judgments on this. This is just simply how we are changing. If anything, this is the epitome of success. This is development in action. This is happening because we have better sanitation, because healthcare is improving, because we are making huge strides in terms of improving pulling people out of poverty. This is inevitable. This is what we're working towards. So it's not just about the fact that we're aging, it's how do we prepare for this? So how do we develop a more resilient society, and our government's waking up to the fact that this is what's coming around the corner. Which, oops, sorry, wrong way, they aren't. So why is this important in terms of the discussion we're having now? Well, it just is, actually. It is because if those other slides show that such a significant proportion of the population is going to be older, over the age of 60, how can you possibly have any kind of activity that addresses the needs of the people who are most vulnerable in society without taking into account older people and aging? But it's not about one group against the other. It's not about old people versus young people. This is really asking the question, what are we doing for an individual at every stage of their life? Are we going to simply forget about them when the age of 49? By the way, some UN statistics stop at the age of 49. So, you know, how are we, what are we prepared to do? In HFA 1, we have some nice words. It's good commitment. It actually allows us to have a lot of conversations with people, but you know, how far did it get us? We're going to hear as well, I think that you know, in terms of people with disabilities as well as with older people, they're basically they're being routinely ignored in a lot of the programs. We did a study in looking at consolidated appeals process, the UN set of kind of funding projects. Looked at over 6,000 projects, looked at all of them from the 2010 to 2011. Out of all those, just 0.78%, less than 1%, included at least one activity targeting older people, and out of that, only 0.3% were actually funded. So, did we achieve that? So we need to have this conversation. We need to be looking at this because, frankly, the system and the agreements, and I'm a big fan of global agreements and holding governments to account, but only if they actually follow through and do things. So a little bit on kind of the realities that older people are facing. We've heard already about Hurricane Katrina, where older people are concerned. Again, it's really striking. 75% of the casualties in Hurricane Katrina are people aged 60 and over, even though they represent only 16% of the population. 75%, 16%. That is striking. In the tsunami in Japan, 56% of the casualties were 65 and older, even though they only represented 23% of the population. Something isn't right here. Something's not working. Words sometimes don't really do justice and don't help us to really understand the situation. And you know, we're talking about situations here that are really mind-blowing and actually really hard to understand. So in the Philippines, Hurricane Haiyan, Typhoon Haiyan, we all know the devastation was awful. This is just one of the scenes. I just want you to have a moment to look at this scene and just to think about this for a second. What does this mean in terms of somebody who is over the age of 60, over the age of 65, it might even be 50, 55, but somebody who is already considered to be older? Are they going to be able to get access to the assistance that these people are queuing up for? Even if they actually manage to get on the line and get it to the front of the queue, what are they going to be given? Are they going to be able to carry it? If they can carry it, does it have the things in it that they need as older people? I want you to try to remember that image because I'm going to come back to it. And we're talking about this not just because of older people, as we said, it's about a person at all points of their lives. Well, at all points of their lives, when you do reach later life, let's face it, our bodies change. There are differences that occur. So there are diseases, there are illnesses that are affecting us in older age that don't necessarily affect us younger, non-communicable diseases, diabetes, hypertension. When, especially, in these emergency situations, your body can be more susceptible to disease. Nutrition. We do need different types of food. We have to, and, just think about it, you might not have all your teeth. You might not be able to actually digest and chew the things. So if we're talking about, humanitarian relief, if we're trying to actually help people who need it most, how can we do that unless we're actually giving them people that actually meet their nutritional requirements and they can actually digest? And then finally, mobility. Many older people, not all, some older people, will not be able to move. They're not going to be able to make it onto that queue. So how is the system going to get to them? There you go. There are lots of different things that are putting older people at risk. We've got, well, you can just see it up here, poverty and neglect, isolation. We would like to think that we're all, people will rise to the occasion. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And in times of dire emergency, we do find that actually people who are most vulnerable in society don't actually get looked after, and they might find themselves isolated, and they might not be able to get to the assistance they need. As we get older, there's a direct correlation with disability and aging sometimes, not always. And so more older people are disabled, and again, not being able to get around. And double care of burden. Older people aren't actually just sitting around doing nothing. Often these are people who are responsible for caring, not just for, they might be caring for their spouse or their partner, they might be caring as well for their grandchildren. How is that being taken into account in the responses? Are they being given access to the financial transfers, for example, being given access to cash they might need? We've been talking a lot about the problems that older people face in these situations, but age is a number. It doesn't characterize you, it doesn't describe, you cannot really draw any conclusions or assumptions about what a person is capable of simply on the basis of their chronological age. Older people are vibrant members of their community, older people are active, and they are integral to building resilience. And this is a picture of a training exercise that took place that we supported in the Philippines after Hurricane Haiyan. Older people are able to assist and help out in emergency situations as well. And we're not talking, again, who are we talking about as older people? When we think about resilience, building resilience to emergencies and to some of these challenges, we have to bear in mind the roles that older people play already. 70% of men over the age of 60 globally continue to work. 40% of women do. By the way, when you think of the face of an older person over the age of 60, the image I want you to see is that image. It's of an older woman, because there are more older women in this world, so if we're talking about gender and women and girls, we better be thinking about what does that mean in later life as well. So these are the faces that are currently, frankly, being ignored. We've got some nice words in the next draft that we're looking at, but the experience of the past 15 years leaves a lot to be desired. So more can be done, more is being done, but we've got a lot further to go to get past this lens, this filter that actually just ignores all these people. Thanks.
much for that, Ken. And lastly, we've got Ilan Kelman from UCL, who's going to be talking about who's going to be talking about disabilities. So over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for organising it, and to all of you for coming. When we talk about the high-level policy and practice arena, such as what we're talking about with respect to the negotiations in Japan, too often people are grouped and they're labelled. Assumptions are made about what they represent. That is certainly true of people with disabilities, which sounds like a fairly straightforward, rather large homogeneous group, but naturally many different types of physical and intellectual disabilities exist, with a wide range of needs and interests in terms of disaster and reducing the risk from disaster. A colleague, Laura Stowe in Texas, and I decided that there was actually a very easy, straightforward, simple way to try to understand what people with disabilities need in disaster and disaster risk reduction. Ask them. We decided to co-edit the book, which will be published in July, for which we solicited narratives and commentaries from people with disabilities in terms of their experience with disaster and disaster risk reduction. Many of the narratives come from people who had never before authored a published piece. One chapter is from Inga, who is an older woman living in Indonesia. She has mobility difficulties due to childhood polio. She writes how she feels invisible, describing how a colleague runs away when she gets off the bus because the colleague does not know how to help. Crossing the road, getting on and off a bus, being splashed by traffic as she's walking alongside. These are the disasters from everyday risk which Inga experiences, as is basic social interaction. So in her own words, being independent as a woman with disabilities is not often appreciated by people without disabilities. Many people treat me as if I'm inferior. Can I help you? Asked the nurse, who noticed I was fumbling with my wristwatch after a medical examination. I wanted to yell, "What's wrong with me? Leave me alone. I can do these things by myself. I only need more time. I'm not less than you are." In Costa Rica, Marcos Eduardo Barquero Varela lives with visual impairment, seizures, and intellectual disability. Marcos writes about an earthquake. I was on the front porch reading when it started shaking non-stop. Once it calmed down, I could stand up and I went to the back of the house. The maid was in the back of the house, and she was very scared and said that we should run out of the house. I told her no, that my grandfather had taught me in situations like this, one had to be calm. I held her by the arm because she was very nervous. When it stopped shaking, I gave the maid a glass of water to drink to help her calm down. This story to me is rather boring. It's simply one person helping another during an earthquake. Disability does not really appear, although if we must label people that way, then we see the person with disabilities help the person without disabilities. Very mundane, very simple. Inga actually wrote her own story. For Marcos, it was transcribed and translated, because not everyone can write. So we also have stories from parents of children with disabilities. We have other family members voicing their own personal experiences of dealing with someone who has disabilities throughout their entire life in the context of disaster. Marcy Roth works with disability and disaster in the US, and she writes, on the morning of August 29, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina was making landfall in the Gulf, I received a call from a colleague whose sister-in-law, Benilda Caixeta, was trapped in her home in New Orleans. Benilda was quadriplegic, paralyzed from the shoulders down, and she'd been trying to evacuate her home for 3 days. As I learned of her situation, I thought I could use my contacts to help. I stayed on the phone with Benilda for most of the day, assuring her that help would come as soon as possible. I was on the phone with her that afternoon when she told me with panic in her voice, the water is rushing in, and then her phone went dead. We learned 5 days later that she'd been found in her apartment dead, floating next to her wheelchair. A common theme amongst most of our authors is that they rarely assign blame to personal characteristics to disability. They rarely assign the disability as being the cause of vulnerability, clearly illustrated by the number. Instead, they focus on the environmental and social factors that hinder people from preparing, participating, and responding as independently as the people deserve and desire. In fact, Laura and I were quite taken aback about how relatively little the authors wrote about their disability in the first draft of their chapters. We usually had to request more about that disability. We even had authors decline to write because they had no idea how to work the disability into their narrative. They took it as an obvious truism that people with disabilities are never simply recipients of assistance. They are never just helpless victims in disaster. People with disabilities have the potential for action, for self-help and self-determination, and that should be part of dealing with disasters, which is actually the same for everyone. Additionally, people with disabilities can and should take some responsibility for their own disaster risk reduction and their own disaster response, just as everyone should. Conversely, the reality which we are trying to change is that the social environment often directly inhibits people with disabilities from participating in disaster-related activities on their own terms. We are trying to change that, and we'll see whether or not the agreement next week does change it. So when we look at the zero draft, I direct you to Part 5, Clause 34, Subclause C, number 3. Everyone's still with me in that way, where it says, persons with disabilities are critical in the assessment of risk and design and implementation of plans tailored to specific requirements in line with the principles of universal design. Are we all with that?
It's catchy.
It's very catchy. 28 words, a couple of grammatical errors, but that's okay. It might have helped Inga, Marcos with the CK. And this is completely irrelevant to how he responded in the earthquake. It would not have saved another. So, society should indeed focus on people with disabilities as one group, but as emphasized in the first word of that phrase, they are people, as all of us are. They have the same rights and the same duties as all of us do with respect to disaster and disaster response. Disability is there because of what we and our environment does to them. Disability has nothing whatsoever to do with inability. One of our authors, Christy Harginger, said with respect to the disability she lives with, that's not who I am, not at all. So our job, irrespective of disability or lack thereof, is to all use our own exceptional abilities as being people in this world to make the world safer for those who have disabilities and those who do not. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. So now it's kind of the audience participation part of the evening. Sorry, I have to move you again. Apologies. So this is the bit where I kind of come up with the idea that it would be really useful for us to be able to take over a list of asks, really. So I'm going to Sendai next week. I'm hoping to be able to produce a kind of a wish list of things we would like to see in the final text that ensure that these kind of at-risk groups of people are represented fairly and equitably in the final text. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions to our panel members. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. But based on what you've seen today and what you've heard, please also, if you would like to suggest a point that you would like to have, or you'd like to kind of add to that wish list that I will take over to Sendai with me, please feel free to state that as well. And I'm not being rude, it's just my pen has run out, so I will be typing it up on my laptop. So I'm going to disconnect this so you don't all see my spelling mistakes. So right, floor. Any questions? Because if not, I have about 100. Any? Yes.
Well, let me open the floor.
Thank you. Sorry, and could you just kind of introduce yourself and say where you're from or how you're interested in DRR, please? Thank you.
I'll do that. Well, my name is Martin. I'm a student of disasters. I'm taking Master of Science in Disasters Adaptation and Development at King's College London.
Okay.
Originally, I'm from Kenya, but I'm here now in the world. Well, I want to say first thank you for those very interesting presentations, and go directly to the last presenter who mentioned some catchy words. I think catchy words are words that are really common in all these conventions, international conventions, starting with the Brundtland Commission of 1982, I think, all the way. HFA 1 also had that. The National Decade for Disaster Risk Reduction had all those, and all these people who sit down, the peers you will be communing with next week, are people that were versed with language. They will write all those things very nice. They will adopt very nice. Some of them will critique the zero draft so that it looks impeccable when it is presented to the world. But how does that translate into the effectiveness of disaster risk reduction on the ground? How do we ensure that really we have the commitment? And I think part of my message to the Sendai team would be, we can avoid the language. We can avoid, I don't care if you use very perfumed language to refer to the aged, all right? But I would want to see tangible actions, actionable points. You can put them in poor language, but let them refer to these at-risk groups. And I think that is something we have missed. I don't know who sits there, whether, do we have, I have never sat or, I've only sat in a couple of conferences, local conferences or national conferences, but I don't know who will be representing the aged, who will be representing the indigenous people, who will be representing, women in those conferences.
Yeah.
Are they? Because for me, I think the poor are also at risk. That's another group which we did not mention here. Yeah. The poor. And I know poverty here may have a different, when you hear about poor person, you may think of something different. But there are really, really, really poor people in those places that are extremely vulnerable to or exposed to DRR. So I think it's, I'd want to hear from him whether, I don't know whether that's how you want it.
Yeah, Elan.
Whether you think having catchy language in HFA2 and all these other, any other thing that, any other document that we will have will translate into real action on the ground, not only for the aged people, but for all the other at-risk groups that we have mentioned.
Yeah, so Elan, if you could
absolutely
have a go at answering that.
But we also have to be careful of the language that we use. None of these groups that were presented here are at-risk groups. They are people. They have capacities. They are able to deal with it. If we want to label at-risk, we're all at risk. There's a particular irony here today that Kevin is male, Ken is not aged, I don't have a disability, and Em is not Indigenous. So what does this mean for representation?
Yeah.
I actually don't see that as a limitation. I see it as a fact that we are people, we all have our characteristics, we can all deal with them, and it's about working together to help each other. Fundamentally, I agree with you, it's about action. And I don't see a lot of action came out of the DRR Framework. And at the moment, I don't particularly like being pessimistic. I suppose I'm more of a cynical optimist. but I don't see how much the SFA, the Sendai Framework Agreement, is really going to lead to this action that we need.
I can follow on from that. You know, what first of all, you know, you cannot expect a room full of negotiators, UN negotiators, to come up with catch-all language. You know, line-by-line negotiations on documents don't result in strong communications tools. Okay, but what they do arrive at are commitments that are often not met. But you know, how do we make that leap? How do we move from fine aspirations on a page to real changes in people's lives? Well, first of all, it's about, you know, what the agreement allows us to start is a dialogue and a discussion, and to hold governments account to what they should be doing. Not just governments, the UN agencies, ourselves, actually. You know, when we look at what is the behavior of other humanitarian actors, are they actually taking into account, when we're talking about, you know, these groups as being marginalized, let's be clear, they're being marginalized by society, not because there is anything inherent in it, it's because we are taking implicitly, explicitly active steps to make it difficult for these people to play, you know, a more vibrant role in society. So it's a starting point. The other thing, though, that really is crucial at driving this, these kinds of things to action is knowledge, is evidence, is understanding things and seeing it. And that's one of the things that's potentially very exciting about what is being discussed at the moment with the other post-2015 discussion, the one that's not happening in Sendai, but going on in New York around the Sustainable Development Goals, this call for disaggregated data. Very hard to achieve. It's already going through lots of conflict and people saying, no, we can't do this, we can't do that. But, you know, going back to kind of my slides, you know, if we can't make people visible, if we cannot gather data on them, people with disabilities are completely absent from the Millennium Development Goals. Older people too. So these are groups that were actually, I would say, institutionally marginalized by the UN member states by simply that they were written out of that very important framing agreement. That's hopefully not going to happen this time around, but it's getting governments to really kind of drive down and to do the hard work, which is to put money into the offices, the statistical agencies that are responsible for developing this, so that way we can get the evidence we need to really see what's happening on the ground.
Great. And Emma, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and this is, you know, as my colleagues here have been saying, it's the start of a discussion. Everyone wants to put their kind of point in and make sure that every group is addressed, or every type of aspect is addressed in that as a starting point. That does not mean anything has to happen. It's not a commitment. Governments don't have to sign up to it. They don't have to say, we promise to do X by X. It's kind of the start of a discussion. I think the targets and indicators that come from this discussion and where the real crucial aspects are going to be, that's what's going to hold governments to account, and that's what they should then be signing up to and addressing. So I think the key point is now the means of implementation. How is it going to be accounted for? Who's going to be promoting it? And who's going to be responsible at the end of the day? And then who's going to be measuring that progress? And I think the links with the other frameworks are going to be really crucial. And we'll see what happens, you know, in September for the SDGs, and also in December at the climate conference, and how these are all interlinked.
I think you touched on a really interesting point. I was actually at the ODI conference yesterday, where they had a DFID representative who touched on kind of that this is a beginning of a process. Although we're kind of moving on from that HFA 1, and really the process has started. You know, the language that's been adopted in the zero draft and the following revisions of that draft you know, it's a starting process. It was never going to be a perfect language to begin with, and you know, to go back to your point, catchy language, as Ken said, is always very difficult to attain at any kind of governmental or international level. So it's a starting process, and I think we, as Ken and Ilan and Emma have all said, we need to use that as a kind of a starting post and to move forward. So, sorry, Vidya, you had a question, sorry, and then I'll come back to you.
Thanks, Kevin. My name is Vidya. I'm from IMC Worldwide. It's a consultancy, and my area is actually social development, though DRR in itself isn't a specialist area of mine. So I had a couple of sort of comments and questions around this sort of issue about incentives, particularly when you're looking at policy level. I've had a very little bit of experience sort of working at policy level. And the moral arguments, I think, were really clear. And I think most people, if not everybody in this room, would agree that we're all completely convinced by those sort of moral arguments of why we should be sort of paying more attention to vulnerable and more marginalised groups. But what I've sort of experienced is that it's the economic, political and security-based arguments that we push for policy level commitments. And that's kind of what will make the difference between something that's just written on paper and that's actually sort of acted upon. And I think, Emma, what you said about being really, like, mapping out the steps of who does what is really important, particularly with, like, knowledge sharing. But I wonder what, I guess, you're doing in your respective areas around sort of emphasising what knowledge and experience and contextual understanding can be brought by these groups, because that's where it really lies, and how you can bring them out so that they can be applied. Because I think that's where it gets convincing on the ground.
Okay. That's a great question. Thank you. Does anyone like to start something?
Sure, I'll kick off. I mean, I totally agree, and it's one of the things that I'm obsessed by at the moment, is the fact that I'm confronted constantly in my engagements with policymakers, people kind of in the Westminster bubble, and others who are making decisions around how to spend money to help people in other countries. And two things that I encounter. One, which people don't want to face up to, but I think occurs very often, which is age discrimination. People are constantly making a judgment about whether or not this person's life basically is valuable, worthwhile, you know? And there's no other word for it. It's discrimination, pure and simple, on the basis of the person's perceived age. How you get past that? Look, we haven't cracked it here in the UK. Like I said before, you know, there's this, we have this bizarre filter that we put over ourselves when we look and shift our gaze to developing countries. I think one of the things that's going to help us is disaggregated data, and the more that we can get the UN agencies to begin to collect some of the basic data, and it's not difficult to do. By the way, when we talk about disaggregated data, and it sounds very boring for you guys, but you know, it's what really drives us, where I come from. But it's you know, 60 plus doesn't cut it. You know, so what you need to do is you need to keep on slicing by 5-year age groups until people die, because huge difference what happens in a person's life at the age of 60 versus what happens then potentially at the age of 80. And if you just do 60 plus, you've lost all of that subtlety, all of the understanding of where marginalization, where vulnerability potentially lies. But in terms of the economic arguments, this is exactly what I'm trying to do. The problem that we face, however, is that when you look at the economic realities, when you actually that are going on in the household, older people are facing are contributing enormous amounts. And I'm going to do a plug for a publication in just a moment, but they're contributing this stuff in the informal sector. It's not part of the formal economy. We were not good at quantifying this. Economists don't like it, and they don't do it because it's hard. So we haven't really made the economic case yet. We haven't made visible just what's going on. In this publication, which is an executive summary, but you can download the folder. I've got a few executive summaries with me, which we just launched. It's an article by a woman named Penny Verasanso, and one of the things that she talks about is that actually underpinning economies, one of the things that has allowed some South Asian countries to be players in terms of the world economy is the fact that you've got grandmothers who are looking after their children and allowing women to be released into the economy, in the formal economy. And that's what's underpinning the economy. It's the contributions that, the invisible economic contributions. So we've got to measure it, we've got to capture it, and you know, if you have any ideas how we can do that, I'd love to talk to you.
I mean, it's interesting because in terms, if I look at it in a disaster point of view, just that one alone, I don't know what the evidence base looks like at the moment to look at in a disaster, an isolated incident, what is the value of that demographic. But I know of one case that was rebuilding a community structure or rebuilding towns or villages post tsunami, for example, leaving out that knowledge that exists and the kind of in a community structure, people generally will look to the elders and will kind of follow and respect the customs and directions given by that demographic, rather than either new people, NGOs, consultants, whoever, UN coming in. If that knowledge is lost, things can be rebuilt in an extremely expensive and wasteful way. And I don't know what kind of evidence has been gathered on exactly how much waste has been accumulated from projects that have kind of built things.
Another point.
Well, that's, I think, in terms of economy, one thing is trying to quantify the value of people on a day-to-day basis. Another thing is going, X number of $1 million has been wasted in the last 5 years, and that's quite a way to kind of gain impact.
Yeah, but yeah, that's.
I don't really know about that.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a
case study that you've had of things going horribly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. But I think maybe we hear from the other two panel members if that's okay. And Emma, if you.
Again, good point. I think after the Indian Ocean tsunami, there were a number of examples of where actually traditional local knowledge had been used and had helped people prepare and actually respond to that disaster and save lives, like the example that I used. But I know there are other examples where people managed to save themselves by retreating to higher ground, and they saw what was going to happen to the tsunami based on the behavior of the ocean, retreated and had their houses rebuilt away from the ocean and out of sight of that. So actually, if another tsunami happened, they wouldn't have had that traditional knowledge or knowledge to be able to kind of anticipate it and prepare for that. So I think there needs to be more done in terms of, as I was saying, integrating the science and local knowledge, and that needs to be done in a really participatory way, looking at the different benefits, acknowledging the challenges at the same time, but doing that kind of assessment, dialogue, and then action in terms of where you're going with these frameworks and moving forward.
Great.
For me, it's not so much about paying more attention to vulnerable and marginalized groups, but paying more attention to ourselves about why we make them vulnerable and marginalized. So I very much liked your phrase, knowledge, experience, and contextual understanding, which we absolutely have to pay more attention to for everyone. And I would throw in one more word, that of wisdom, to ensure that we're learning from everyone, we're teaching everyone, and we ensure that all of us work together to avoid anyone being more vulnerable than others or more marginalized than others.
Fantastic. Sorry, can I?
I just want to put a reality
sure.
check in this. I mean, let's not romanticize things either. I think it's one of the reasons why you need to take all groups into account is precisely sometimes because you have people who are of influence and who are respected. They sometimes don't have the right answers, but they're all going to influence what goes on, and unless you involve them and you're able to understand the impact and the contribution they're making, you're going to potentially be spending a lot of money and find it being undermined simply because there are other forces that are maybe not working in your favor.
Maybe to mention for her benefit and the benefit of others, last year was, I think the Aged was, they were incorporating the theme for the International Day of Disaster Risk reduction. And when you go to the website, there are very, very interesting case studies of how that knowledge of the aged, how the aged people have been incorporated and integrated in some places in Latin America, in Kenya, and some other parts of the world. It would be interesting, but it's getting used. That knowledge and the knowledge of the aged is getting used and utilized by some people, but I think it needs to be, we need to up that game and document such cases.
Great, no, thank you. That's a useful addition there. Sorry, you had a question.
Well, hello, my name is Natalia. I'm from Colombia. I'm doing the Masters of Disasters and Adaptation too. Well, for me, what I would like to hear about these forums, like not just this DRR one, but in general, all the UN big forums, is actually a change of the language, like a completely, like a real change in the language. What I'm meaning with this, it's about questioning a serious discussion of how this language or these usual strategies are working or not. For example, we always hear about participation. So why don't we ask how this participation is working? Who is getting to participate? So this, for me, is not going to be a change, a real transformation if we don't change the language.
Okay.
These big words of sustainability, of participation are getting without a meaning, without a real meaning. So first that. Then, for example, I always think about the example of urban planning. How, for example, you will achieve a real interaction between disaster risk management and other disciplines, such as urban planning, to achieve, for example, to include the people that is living in informal settlements, that they are vulnerable and there are disabled people there, they are aged people living there, they are indigenous people living in those kind of situations, but it's more about how the broader social structures are influencing that vulnerability condition. So that kind of discussion is not taking place because it's not comfortable, because you have to recognize that disaster risk management is related to a broader structure that is not working.
Yeah.
So in a UN conference, it's difficult to have that kind of approach, and I think that it's necessary in order to get some transformation to really question how you're building bridges of discussion between knowledge. So I know that the indigenous people have a lot to say on how you're going to include that in informal policies, right? And then, well, for the panel, maybe just as we are speaking about special groups, I would like to ask if you think that that this kind of frameworks should include these specific groups as targets, or just claim for a broader approach of how to understand people's context and vulnerabilities, and how like specific conditions are getting people more vulnerable to a specific hazard. Because sometimes maybe in my country the majority is the poverty, the poor people. And who is focusing on the majority that is poor, right? And I think that's I don't have the answer for that, but I think that kind of discussions lead to that reflections, and I would like to hear your thoughts about that.
If I could get thoughts very briefly, please, because we're running out of time. So just maybe a couple of sentences, and if we start with Ken, sorry, we'll work that way.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good question. I wasn't very prepared to answer first.
All right. Would you like me to start the other end?
Go on.
Right. I think it's important to look at different people and the fact that there are different contexts. You're absolutely correct. The social, economic, cultural processes that exist are what can make people more vulnerable or at risk to disasters. And people at Sendai and in September at the UN Young UNGA don't want to address those issues. I think it's really difficult.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of the context behind it. So I think that is where the targets need to be set in terms of social protection access to basic services, things that will enable people and provide them with capacity to actually deal with the disasters or hazards themselves. I also think, although they mention all the different stakeholders, which I think is important because otherwise people do get left out, we shouldn't look at a target just on different individual groups, and it should be about empowering and including everybody in this process.
Fantastic, thank you.
Absolutely brilliant points. I hope you continue to make those and publicize those. I would only caution that when we do criticize a language, to be careful of the language we use. To use the word transformation a few times. It's a buzzword which is faded in, it's going to fade out, it's meaningless, and it really doesn't help the debate at all. Your specific question, should specific groups be mentioned? Politically, we have to, and if we don't, we forget them. But I would have no objection to 25 groups labeled, listed, which covers 100% of the population. And that would be my approach. I think ultimately what we need to try and do is actually bring people together exactly as you said, and having 3 separate processes, DRR, climate change, and sustainable development groups, is also incredibly counterproductive, particularly since climate change adds nothing different to the debate, which disaster risk reduction does not have already. And when you look at the language of the agreements, DRR adds nothing new to the debate, which the sustainability approach is missing. So I would actually say, let's all join together, let's talk about what we mean, and stop using these big fancy buzzwords, which are not only hard to translate into other languages, they're hard to translate into action.
Fantastic. And Ken, last.
Yeah, well, now I remember what I was going to say. Look, there's an expression in English, catch-22 situation. We need to talk about groups because it's what allows us to make things visible when they're not being visible. It also is the thing that allows individuals sometimes to have voice where they otherwise can't be heard. But with respect to later life, we're not really talking about older people as a separate group. What we're talking about is aging. We're talking about life course. We're talking about the journey that a person goes through at all stages of their life. Unfortunately, we simply are not capturing that in what we do, in what we write, and in what we research and see throughout the UN system, whether we're talking about resilience, you name it, it's just not there. So in order to make that happen, we do have to shout a little bit louder, we do have to talk about specific groups, but I agree entirely. What we want is 25 groups that captures 100% of the population. You know, we want not to leave anyone out, and we never will reach 100%, and it'll always be imperfect, but nonetheless we have to keep struggling.
Fantastic. Are there any further questions? It would need to be a very, very quick question. Yes, Heather.
I mean, mine's more of a general comment.
Great.
My name's Heather Pearson. I'm a global mental health and disability consultant. So there's 2 groups and 1.
Consultants is a under
3.
Very marginalized.
So my background is primarily in disability, and so I'm very guilty of waving my disability flag everywhere I went. And this is a general comment in terms of the document, and it can actually be relevant to many global documents in that we tend to compartmentalize these different groups, which is important, and it means that we can address the different groups and give them a voice. But then my concern is that then we don't address the fact that people with disabilities can be women, and that older people are part of Indigenous groups, and it becomes quite complex. And while it makes for a very clean, beautiful document, it doesn't really reflect the nature of humanity. And you know, it's important to segregate data in terms of age, but then do we segregate even within that? So it was more of, I don't know if there's comments on that, but it's something that has come up a lot in my own personal work at the moment, and I'm interested to hear what you think.
Fantastic, thank you for that question, and I'll start, and then if you want to add something, you're more than welcome. But yeah, I mean, I think that's, you've touched on a really important issue there. I think you know, disaggregated data and that kind of collection of data that would help us to explore those issues better. It isn't as simple as collecting, you know, gender data or age data. It is much more collaborative. And I think that's partly kind of the reason why maybe it hasn't happened yet in a scale that we would like to have seen, because when you do start dividing them down those lines, it actually becomes incredibly complex. Taking an individual kind of subset is relatively easy, but you know, you could end up with a massive data, and then it's very difficult to try and process that data. So I completely agree, and I think, you know, we do need to have those cross sections. We do need to have that collaboration. But I wonder whether that's so far has been the kind of the barrier in getting us to that point. Do any of the panel have anything else to add?
I agree.
Okay.
No, absolutely brilliant. And again, thinking about who's involved in these processes, again, there's a particular irony that this document and a good proportion of the disaster risk reduction and disaster response policies are actually controlled and directed by elderly people. When we look at our leaders and the ages,
who ironically don't self-identify as being.
Yeah, exactly.
It's true.
So again, look to ourselves is my final answer.
Fantastic. And Emma, very, very briefly, if you could.
Very, very quickly, I completely agree. And going back to one of your first points, one of the main group that aren't kind of included in a lot of these drafts is just poverty and people who are poor. Within that, there are then women, people with disabilities. So I think it's really important we somehow capture all of that, and I'm not sure, like you say, how that is done.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we've come to.
So, Kevin, before, as you make your remarks,
yes.
would you kindly tell us how optimistic you are with this? He said he's very pessimistic.
Yeah.
About this
yeah.
Would you really, like, you are going there probably next week? So
yeah, Emma's also going.
Yeah, highlight something, whether we should be, we should expect something from there.
Okay. That's like the million pound question, isn't it? Yes, I'm not optimistic. I think as much as the DRR community and humanitarian community see the issues, I think, as Ken pointed out, trying to get negotiators at a state level to understand those and to understand that kind of specific detail is incredibly difficult. So I think a lot of the nuances that we've discussed today are going to be pasted over in terms of simplified text. That's my own view. I hope that I'm wrong, but I don't think I will be. I think that we're going to end up with a framework that's maybe a bit better than HFA1, but nothing special. Ken, do you?
Look, if you lower your expectations, you won't be disappointed, right?
Well, that's a sad state of affairs, isn't it?
Well, we shouldn't expect what this can't deliver. It's a document that has a specific purpose. It's an agreement. It will give us things to work with. It is going to have language in there which is useful. It won't do everything, but the point is not what. That's only the starting point, and it's what we do with it actually that's going to make all the difference. So don't expect more than what these governments can deliver in terms of the agreement. The question is back to you: how are you going to use it to hold them accountable?
So you'd identify yourself as a realist as opposed to an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm a glass half full kind of guy.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. And Elon, do you have any brief comments to make? Emma?
Not much over what's just been said. I think next week in Sendai will be challenging. There's still a chance to potentially influence negotiations. They haven't all been finalised, but the extent to which we can do that, I think, is going to be absolutely minuscule. There's going to be lots of ministries in different meeting rooms having these discussions, which we might not be a part of, or probably aren't going to be a part of. So it's going to be, while we're there, about actually trying to speak to those people, speak to the people who are interested in the aspects that we think are important. And then going back to the, his point is actually about means of implementation and measuring that progress afterwards.
Thank
I have a
you.
quick question. Oh yes, what will it take?
What
will it take? So you say that the kind of chance of it being taken into account will be minuscule. So what would it take for it to be significant?
I just think at this stage we have non-government ministers have little chance of really influencing when we're in Japan.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be different people there. There's potentially 10 or 12,000 people
10,000, I
there.
think, is the last estimate. Yeah.
You know, we're definitely there trying to make a difference and have an influence there, but I think the discussions might be quite closed, and it'll be trying to have discussions with people outside of those closed meetings.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's trying to influence people who you can't get access to. I think that's where the difficulty will lie.
And making contact with them to say, okay, if you're serious about this, how can we potentially help you after Sendai in implementing these aspects?
I mean, to strike at the real heart of your question, how do we actually implement DRR? And fundamentally, as a species, we're absolutely brilliant at preventing the disaster which just happened. So it's a fundamental aspect of my research to think ahead of disaster. How do we do that at the individual level, right at the policy level? And I've come up with very few answers. But if anyone wants to do a PhD or a master's or something on this topic, what you've asked strikes at exactly what the whole point of DRR is and exactly why it is.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We have come to the end of the time that I've booked this room for now, so I'm going to have to shut you all out. But although we didn't have any kind of suggestions for the list, I think actually what's been discussed, I will be able to develop a wish list of sorts. And if you are interested in seeing what I've developed, please drop me an email or a tweet. And my Twitter's on the invite that you would have received. So yes, thank you very much for coming, and we'll be in touch with regards to the next event soon, hopefully. So thank you.